Saline City Planning Commission meeting. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Will the recording secretary please call roll?
Carroll?
Here.
Fosdick?
Here.
Morrow?
Here.
Gearbaugh?
Here.
Cole? Beardsley?
Here.
Troika?
Here.
Heft?
Staff present tonight are Community Development Director Harrington and Recording Secretary Katnick. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
Yeah, I want to add trees and site plans for discussion.
I'll second the motion to approve his agenda, then noting the one addition.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes of February 22nd, 2023 as amended or submitted?
Move to approve as submitted, Madam Chair. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person.
We did receive, I'm sorry.
Please come to the podium.
Is that my cue? Okay. Big crowd. All right. Rob Bohr, a resident since 1999, 210 West Michigan Avenue is the address. My comments are in regard to Ordinance 853. I believe they were drafted by Ben. And I want to congratulate Ben on a nice job. Overall, the ordinance is excellent. I agree with everything, with the only exception is the maximum allowable number of chickens allowed. Like I said, everything looks good as far as the safety, keeping of chickens, and keeping of basic tidiness of the city of Saline by how these chickens are supposed to be managed. I do think 6 is too small a number of chickens for 5 reasons, really. Ben, are my comments part of the documents that everybody has?
They're not, no.
Okay. So I did send Ben a rather detailed explanation of my reasoning. And I can summarize. 1 is the overall impact on neighborhoods as far as noise, disturbance, and smells. 2 is space requirements. 3 would be fundamental purpose of having chickens, i.e. getting eggs. 4 would be a humane and philanthropic purpose. And then 5 would just be comparisons to other communities. So all of those would support having a higher number than 6. And I would propose the number being 12. So I'm happy to go into great detail on every one of those items. But I think 12 chickens would be no different than 1 barking dog in a backyard. I've had a barking dog neighbor for years, and I would say my chickens are considerably more pleasant than that 1 barking dog. So, and I would say probably the poo created by my 12 chickens might be even less than that 1 barking dog. So that's more or less the summary of item 1. Number 2, space requirements. Of course, you need to prevent chickens from roaming at large. You'd need some kind of an enclosure. That's common sense. You also need a coop. That's just also part of generally accepted agricultural management practices for care of farm animals. So a coop would be about the size of a storage shed in the back of a yard, like you might put your rider mower in. The fencing area might be about the same size as a garden. An average person in the city of Saline might have 10 by 12 would be the minimum requirement for 12 chickens. So many people might even enclose a garden to keep out deer and rabbits to preserve the food for themselves, and that would almost be the exact same parameters as a chicken coop. So, fundamentally, I think 12 would provide enough eggs for a family of 4 to 5. 6 chickens or less would not actually give enough eggs for a family. It might be sufficient for a family of 2, but certainly not a family of 4 or 5. You'd still have to go, excuse me?
3 minutes. Thank you, sir.
3 minutes is up? Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Public hearing, number 23-13, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 853, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for,
I'm sorry, we do have
oh,
one
I'm
more.
so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Please continue.
We do, our clerk did receive an email regarding the chicken ordinance, and I'll just read it into record. Hello, City Council officials. I was today made aware of a new ordinance being considered to limit the number of chickens to 6 per parcel in the city of Saline. I urge you to reconsider this number. My family currently owns 6 chickens in the city of Saline and already purchased an order a few weeks ago for 5 more scheduled for delivery. We have a great setup for our chickens and have had absolutely no complaints from our neighbors. Our coop and run is very secure, and it is a converted playhouse that is visually appropriate for our neighborhood. We ordered more pullets, which are baby hens, in order to fully provide eggs for our family of 6. It is not ideal to raise chickens and still need to purchase store-bought eggs like we are currently. Our current 6 chickens provides us with 3 to 4 eggs per day, less in the winter. With 4 kids, this does not meet our needs. One of my 13-year-old daughters, we have twins, eats 3 eggs every morning for breakfast alone. When I factor in other uses, I am still buying 2 to 3 dozen store-bought eggs per week. We are vegetarian and eggs are our main source of protein. If the limit of chickens was raised to 12, this would allow families to fully provide eggs for themselves. If the concern for noise is an issue, I think having a no rooster regulation would be effective enough while allowing up to 12 hens. Hens do make some noise when they lay their eggs. Chicken people call this the egg song. However, at their absolute loudest, they do not come anywhere close to a standard barking dog. As we have 2 hound dogs, much louder than standard, living behind us, I can tell you our entire court area is more concerned with listening to them than our chickens. As far as cleanliness, our coop and run is set up in a way that makes cleaning a breeze. The run floor is a sand base that makes it actually like scooping, raking a large kitty litter. For the coop itself, we have a large door and just rake everything out into a barrel. Smell has never been an issue. Our chickens have brought a lot of joy to our little area of the neighborhood with all the kids coming to visit. They are all excited to meet the new chicks when they arrive and watch them grow. They have been able to learn to care for them and collect their eggs. Our closest neighbor kids love to hold them as well. They are wonderful pets that also give us food. Chickens are pretty hard to beat. Please reconsider raising the chicken limit to 12.
Thank you. All right, public hearings, number 23-13, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 853, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 5, Section 5.13, pet ownership in residential districts to allow the keeping of chickens in Saline. We have a memo dated March 2nd, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington.
I keep getting shocked by this thing. So the benefit of this, too, is that they'll open the public hearing, and you'll be able to finish the remainder of your comment. So it was the public comment period, then a public hearing. So we'll be able to finish the rest of those thoughts in just a minute here. So this is Ordinance 853. It's Action Item 2313. It is a zoning ordinance amendment. Per our other zoning ordinance amendments, they're all citywide changes, so they affect everybody in the city, every property that's zoned for this. It's specifically for residential properties. We have a larger animal ordinance that prevents at-large animals, that deals with noisy animals, et cetera. And then I'll also note, too, that this is an important thing when considering residential properties, that our regulations do not usurp the rules of an HOA. So if an HOA, through a private deed restriction, determines that someone is not allowed to possess chickens or not allowed to have a fence or not allowed to have a shed or a detached garage, that's between them and their HOA. That has nothing to do with the city, but they could be privately sued for conducting any of those actions. So our current code is displayed here. From my understanding, and the genesis of this ordinance, as I wrote in my memo, is that code enforcement came to me saying that we have an issue of having chickens in the city. The general rule of thumb is if something is not specifically enumerated in our code, if there's the opportunity to specifically enumerate, and we do specifically enumerate, so we have small animals, we have marine fish, domesticated dogs, and household cats. We have a specific enumeration list of animals per allowed. If it's not included in that list, the natural legal interpretation needs to be that they are not then allowed. So since chickens are not specifically enumerated, it was my interpretation, and the same of our legal counsel then, that chickens would then not be allowed. But talking to city council members, that was never the intent, seemingly, when they changed the ordinance however many years ago. So that's how we got to the proposed code. So we took it to code review to say, what do you think of this? Does the regulation need to be changed? They agreed that the council should set a clear directive to allow chickens or to not allow chickens, and that's how we got to where we're at. The council decided they encouraged me to allow chickens, but make it a very easy and simple to understand ordinance. So the first part of our proposed code is Article 5, Section 513. It would put chickens confined solely within the rear yard as defined in Section 2.08 of the Saline City Zoning Ordinance. That's important to note because that curtails any conversations about what is a rear yard. So our code defines what a backyard is. In the interest of corner lots, it's the opposite side of the house from the driveway is the formal rear yard. The other yard would be considered a side yard. So that's the important clause in that one. And then for the next, we established a handful of regulations. It's slightly different than what the Code Review Committee saw because we just cleaned it up per their recommendations a little bit, but none of the substance of the ordinance has changed at this point. So first and foremost, no keeping of roosters in the community. We established up to 6 hens per parcel, no slaughter of chickens on the premise, waste materials, feed, manure, litter shall be disposed of in a sanitary manner, and not piled up or otherwise stored on the property. Chicken feed must be stored in a manner that is impervious to rodents. Chickens shall be provided with a secure, well-ventilated, roofed, and lockable enclosure. The floors and wall of the structure shall be kept in a clean and sanitary condition. All enclosures from the keeping of chickens shall be constructed so as to prevent rats, mice, or other rodents from being harbored underneath, within the walls of the enclosure. And lastly, chickens must be kept in their covered enclosure or in a fenced yard area at all times. During daylight hours, chickens may be allowed outside their covered enclosure in a securely fenced yard, subject to the requirements of Section 7.03, which are fence standards. Chickens shall be secured with their enclosure during non-daylight hours. So essentially just ensuring that chickens are stored in their coop at night. They're free to roam a fenced yard or a fenced area during the day. So as I mentioned, there was a minor format change, but it was a format change suggested by the Code Review Committee. And I'll ask that importantly, too, the Code Review Committee's place was not to determine the appropriate amount of chickens, but rather was this ordinance common sense enough for our residents to understand, and is it enforceable by our city staff, which they agree to. So the issue of how many chickens to have kind of ties into the public comment. So we have received, and I think now 5 public comments I've had sent directly to me, one which was read into the record tonight that was sent to the clerks as well. And they're all advocating to allow 12 chickens as opposed to 6. And the decision to choose 6 on my part was fundamentally, I looked at Milan, Ann Arbor, Howell, that recently passed an ordinance. The previous community I worked for had a chicken ordinance as well. They all ranged somewhere between 2 to 6, and I went with 6 because that seemed most sensical at the time. But really, it's fundamentally a policy question for you or the city council to decide. I do see it as more of an aesthetic issue or question. As to Mr. Boer's point, or Dr. Boer's point, I don't believe there are any added health, safety, or nuisance or security concerns with 12 chickens as opposed to 6. The amount of chickens on the property does not make our animals at large code any less enforceable, or noise ordinance any less enforceable, or any of the other items listed in here less enforceable. It's simply a matter of preference, in my opinion. And that's exactly what the last point is. Any nuisance is no less or no more unique because there are 12 as opposed to 6. There might be maybe potentially a higher occurrence, but using the data Mr. Boer has provided, it does not, Dr. Boer has provided, that does not appear to be the case. So that leads us to some outstanding questions for the Planning Commission to answer as part of their recommendation to the City Council. So first and foremost, is the proposed number of chickens allowed appropriate, or would you like to see it changed? Should chicken coops be considered accessory structures and then permitted as such, or should they be their own standalone item or not included in the ordinance at all? And then are there additional regulations surrounding the keeping of chickens that you think were missed from items A through G? So with that, I would move to recommend that you make approval of Ordinance 853 to the City Council and then include any of that additional feedback from these outstanding questions.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions for Mr. Harrington?
As you addressed taking in a larger flock or whatever, have you considered or discussed anything regarding avian flu issues and concerns? Because at the farm, that's a major issue as you start getting to a bigger flock, and the concerns that because of the precautions and things that need to be taken, that's a worry because it passes between wild birds and domestic birds. So.
I am by no means a bird expert in any sense of the word, so that's out of my wheelhouse in terms of of aesthetics. So to me, it seems the difference between 12 and 6 is not substantial enough to lead to that. But if there are other data that show that I'm wrong on that front, then absolutely, I would encourage us to all review that.
Any additional questions?
Yes, it's not on the agenda today, but we have been talking about density in the city and changing our building codes to increase density. So I'm concerned that if we do that, then room for chickens will be even more delicate, especially in some of those new zoning areas. Just seems that 6 is a reasonable enough number to go with.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could always potentially come back to this if we created a very highly dense residential unit and forbid accessory structures and thus forbid the keeping of pets if you chose to keep this as an accessory structure or chose to make this an accessory structure as well. So there are a couple caveats with there. Two, I would say that even with the density conversation, if you look at that more from the multifamily perspective, then the keeping of chickens just simply isn't likely on a leased property. Usually landlords aren't keen on you having a chicken on, in your little apartment balcony or patio. I don't think that'd probably be in the best interest of the chicken either to have chickens running around an apartment complex. But for small residential lots, high density, small single family lots, you could definitely make a case there that maybe having 12 chickens on a 3,800 square foot lot is not the best use of that space. But once again, I'm by no means an expert on what would be best for the bird in that instance. And I think there are other precautions or other things that would be up to the individual to decide as well. We don't regulate how well people take care of their dogs, for example.
Mr. Gerber?
The other question I have, now with this, Mr. Harrington, do we clearly not allow other types of fowl, like turkeys and ducks?
Correct. So the chickens is narrowly defined. It's still specific enumeration. I think fowl, there's another aspect of our prohibited animals that include exotic animals or livestock. So no, you could not keep a turkey legally in the community even with this ordinance update.
Because, we list pig, cows, and all that stuff. Would it be better for us to add turkeys and ducks?
We definitely could, but from the interpretation of the code that I got from our attorneys, they're already expressly prohibited. So the adding of chickens to this does not change our interpretation of that.
And then the other question I had was regarding you mentioned as the size of the yard, so the chickens could run the entire backyard, or should we put a restriction that it remain within a certain small area? Even when we go back to the fence parameters, it does not mean that they're encased in a fence. They can jump fences, and I didn't know if they have a whole run in the backyard, because my neighbor used to do that, and the chickens would always run out and be in the streets. So.
Right, and I guess in the perspective I viewed it as is that if you had a 4-foot fence, but a Great Dane, for example, that the dog could jump the fence too, at which point our animals at large ordinance would take effect. So there's not any benefit or not benefit from having a chicken. If your chicken's constantly jumping into your neighbor's problem, it's potentially a civil infraction. It's definitely a courtesy notice at your door if it continues to happen and your neighbor has a significant problem with it. So I think there are other measures to address that problem, and I'd prefer to stay out of chicken management with this job and with code enforcement. So.
Do you remember, and most people may know this, but we actually have a limit on the number of dogs you can have on parcel.
Yes.
And it's a pretty conservative number, right? 2 or 3?
It's 3 or you could get a special approval. I think it's actually a special land use to have more than 3 dogs. But I can tell you, I have not once heard of a case of us enforcing that 3-dog limit.
Right.
So.
And there's no minimum yard size or anything like that associated with dogs?
No.
Thank you.
If there's nothing further, Madam Chairman, I would move to acknowledge receipt of the memo dated March the 2nd.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. I have a motion to open the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Public hearing is open at 7:19.
All right, round 2. Okay.
It's also 3 minutes, Dr. Bourne.
3 minutes for this too?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I would like to address Mr. Gerbaugh's concerns. Avian flu is very bad for chickens, but it's really not bad for humans. So if you had to kill your 6 chickens or 12 chickens, I guess it's all the same. Wouldn't make any real difference. Or whether you had 6 or 12, you would still have to kill them. Running the entire backyard, as long as they're, like Ben said, staying in the yard, I guess there's no real issue. There's different rules of thumb, free ranging versus keeping them in a very confined space, and either one is fine. There are some practical reasons you might want to confine them, and that's simply predators. So hawks, raccoons, foxes. I've seen foxes in my backyard. So there are good reasons to kind of enclose it completely, and that really confines the chickens and keeps them very safe, especially if you don't have roosters. Roosters are kind of watchdogs. So if you don't have roosters, you do need to be kind of mindful of predators and knowing how to keep your chickens safe. One thing I'll get to before my 3 minutes runs out is all the communities that Ben didn't mention that have no restrictions on chickens. You can go to Flint, Northville, Redford, Ferndale, Warren, Southfield. 0 restrictions on chickens. You could have as many chickens as you want, as long as they meet basic safety guidelines of the accepted agricultural management practices. Of course, you need a certain amount of space per chicken in your run and in your coop, and that's just humane and necessary. So Ann Arbor limits you to 4. Same thing with East Lansing, but all you have to go to our competitors in Columbus, Ohio, and you're back up to unlimited. So Indianapolis does allow 12. Cumberland, Indiana allows 10. Many other communities allow 6. But the list of unlimited chicken use in a community similar to ours would be many. So I didn't get through all of my 5 points, but I think the humane one was a nice one because not only I appreciated the comments that were read, and because I agree with everything she said, and I think everything she said was very accurate and on point. Let's see, where's my notes here? Yeah, so, the primary purpose of chickens is to really have fresh eggs that you can rely on, you can count on, and that you can consume. So, as she mentioned, 6 is very limiting as far as how many eggs you're going to get for a family. She said she had 4 kids. Yeah, there's no way 6 chickens are going to keep her kids fed. And then any abundance beyond what you actually can use can be given to your family members who live nearby, or even to philanthropic things like giving them to Saline area social services. So to be given as real food to other people who are underserved. So I think all of those reasons would support having 12 instead of 6. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if there's no additional citizen comments, I would move to close the public hearing at 7:22.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, question from Planning Commission members?
I'll start. I came here sort of thinking that the dogs were disrespected because there was such a conservative limit on dogs. Now I'm sort of thinking the chickens are disrespected because the dogs don't have any limits, and the chickens were saying should have limits. And I haven't heard anything that makes me think that there's much of a difference between 6 and 12, in my opinion.
Yeah, my position at least somewhat mirrors that of my colleague, Mr. Beardsley. I think 6 is too restrictive. I'm not sure I'd go as high as 12, but I might be willing to split the difference and do something in the 8 to 10 range. That's just my personal preference.
And just to follow up on that, it would also be possible to require special use for more than 6, because on dogs, according to the ordinance, you can have up to 3, and if you want more than 3, then you have to get a special use permit.
That is correct.
And also, again, with the density issue, if we go with a lower number, but then allow a permit if you have a larger yard, that may work for different size lot yards.
For sure. We do scale accessory structures based on the size of a lot. So you could potentially scale the allowed amount of chickens based on the size of the lot. There's nothing that prohibits us from doing that.
Is the coop the only accessory structure you'd expect with chickens?
At this time, I am not a bird enthusiast. I actually have a little bit of a phobia of birds in general. So you will not find me chicken keeping in Saline. But yes, the only accessory structure I'd be aware of, you could potentially talk about a compost bin, but that's a yard activity. That's not an accessory structure in and of itself.
Do you know if for current coops, we treated them as accessory structures requiring a permit?
I know that there were setbacks for specific coops. The previous chicken ordinance was a lot more encumbersome. And usually I would say that most ordinances like this tend to be redundant because you overregulate, not realizing that you already regulate at-large animals. You already regulate noise variance and noise nuisances and things like that. So, yes.
Does anybody else have comments about the accessory structures for the coops?
I was kind of looking and trying to figure out the size of what they allow for different types of chickens, and it kind of ranges depending on which source you look at. So the thing with the structure is just making sure that it complies with all the setbacks and everything else.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's currently not written to call the coop an accessory structure, and that was intentional because I didn't want to make the decision on that. So I left it open-ended for whomever. So if we'd like to regulate it as an accessory structure, there's just some setbacks that would then apply, but it's 3 feet from the property lines essentially.
I think that we should do that as an accessory structure just to make sure that it doesn't become an issue. Especially if you have it 3 feet, or if you have it right on the yard line right next to somebody's house. We have some smaller yard line setbacks.
You're saying that the coop would be considered it as a structure subject to setbacks?
Shed or a garage, yeah. I just don't know how it should be treated anything else like that when we have a setback. Because even if you build a 4x4 shed, doesn't that still require?
Correct. A shed would be considered under an accessory structure. It's a $75 permit to put one up. That wouldn't apply, obviously, to people who've already previously put up a chicken coop. We would only be enforcing from here on out. So if someone built a new coop in their yard, we would ask them to pull a permit for that.
Because even the recommend, in some of these, it's been like a 4x4 or a 5x7 is the size for 6 to 8 or 7 to 9 chickens. So a 5x7 building.
It's a 35 square foot shed. So I mean, usually we're talking about sheds, like when we get them in the building department, usually ranging between 150 and 400 square feet, I would say is usually the type of shed that we're looking at in the summer when people want to be outside with their gardening equipment. So this would definitely fall potentially below that range, but depending on how many chickens somebody wants, or if they want their chickens to live in a McMansion for chickens, you know, you could have a substantially larger chicken coop.
Well, we don't need to require a permit for that.
You would just want them to follow setbacks. So we could reference the code and say must follow the same setbacks as section.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I don't see a reason why, it's similar, like you can put some sheds up to a certain size, but you don't need a permit for it